Vancouver's housing market didn't just get expensive, it became a crime scene. Right now, experts estimate somewhere between $43 billion and $113 billion is laundered through Canada every single year. But focus on this: in 2018 alone, a staggering $5.3 billion in dirty money flowed directly through British Columbia's real estate, and that criminal cash raised housing prices in a single year by an average of 5%. For some neighborhoods, the increase was closer to 7.5%, all from money laundering alone. This isn't speculation or a wild theory. These are the documented findings from BC's expert panel and the exhaustive 3-year Cullen Commission inquiry. But the raw numbers tell only a part of the story, and the most devastating part is the emotional weight of what happened behind the statistics. This isn't just about an inflated housing market, it's about garbage bags stuffed with cash, brazen casino managers who looked the other way, loan sharks operating openly in parking lots, and government officials who, for years, willfully ignored clear warnings because the dirty money generated a massive tax revenue stream for the province. Before we dive deeper into the mind-blowing corruption, let me ask you a quick favor. If this story is opening your eyes, and you want to keep seeing the hidden truths behind the biggest global scandals, hit that subscribe button. Only a small percentage of you who watch these videos are actually subscribed, and every single time you click it, you're helping me bring these untold stories into the light. Now, let's get back to the core of the Vancouver model. Investigators discovered one man, reporting an average annual income of just over $40,000, who somehow managed to purchase $32 million in Vancouver real estate after moving $114 million from offshore accounts linked directly to organized crime and even, allegedly, the Chinese Communist Party. Think about that single fact and the level of deception it reveals. Worse, nearly half of Vancouver's most expensive homes are held by anonymous shell companies, specifically designed to hide the real owners, a global criminal tactic that found its perfect home on Canada's west coast. The situation became so notorious, so utterly textbook in its corruption, that international intelligence communities gave it a specific, chilling name: the Vancouver Model. This wasn't mere money laundering, it was a sophisticated criminal enterprise connecting BC casinos to the world's most powerful transnational drug cartels. The same dirty cash that fueled Vancouver's real estate boom was also financing the fentanyl epidemic, an epidemic so devastating that, for the first time in modern history, life expectancy actually declined in Canada. The Vancouver model didn't just price working families out of homes, it destroyed lives, funded criminal organizations, and compromised national security. And what happened next would shock everyone, because the true origin of the problem started at a single, unsuspecting location. Between 2010 and 2015, Richmond's River Rock Casino became the absolute ground zero for what investigators would later call the most brazen money laundering operation in Canadian history. The stories emerging from that time defy belief. High rollers, primarily from overseas, routinely showed up with duffel bags, hockey bags, and yes, even garbage bags stuffed with $20 bills. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, sometimes multiple millions, with the bills packaged in stacks consistent with proceeds from drug trafficking. Casino surveillance staff weren't just watching, they were actively documenting loan sharks delivering this suspect cash right to VIP gamblers who had traveled from China explicitly to play high-stakes games in private rooms. One surveillance manager, John Carlo, testified before the Cullen Commission about the shocking scenes he witnessed: high rollers constantly arriving with bags full of cash, ready to gamble. He repeatedly raised concerns, but absolutely nothing changed. Why? Because the business was simply too lucrative to interrupt. Former River Rock General Manager Rick Duff admitted that the VIP room drove a staggering 50% of the casino's revenue. VIP managers, operating almost as criminal facilitators, showered these high rollers with expensive gifts, concert tickets, and gourmet dinners, taking them out personally to keep them happy and, most importantly, gambling. When investigators tried to question these customers about the source of their unbelievable wealth, the casino managers aggressively pushed back. They didn't want anyone, especially not law enforcement, interfering with their golden goose VIP business. The loan sharks, the very architects of the cash flow, began operating so openly they didn't even bother to hide. Paul King Jin, a notorious figure later linked to organized crime, was banned from River Rock Casino in 2012, but he didn't stop. He simply relocated his entire operation to the parking lot, delivering cash directly to gamblers just outside the building. Former compliance manager Robert Croker admitted under oath that he knew Jin was supplying funds to VIPs, but he never instructed staff to turn away customers who were receiving the money. The scale of the system's compliance failure was genuinely staggering. During a single month in 2015, $13.5 million in $20 bills, all believed to be proceeds of crime, was accepted at River Rock. By 2014, the suspected narco-cash from overseas flowing through BC casinos was forecasted to reach an eye-watering $200 million per year. An RCMP investigation back in 2012 had already flagged River Rock and New Westminster's Starlight Casino as a very significant source of money laundering, using wealthy individuals as willing, or perhaps unwitting, pawns in a much larger, darker game. The true scandal is that the sheer volume of this criminal activity was an open secret for years. The process used by these criminal actors was simple, elegant, and chillingly effective, but it required a stunning level of institutional complicity to succeed. Gamblers arrived with the suspicious cash from loan sharks and converted it directly into casino chips. They didn't even need to gamble. The cash was laundered the moment it was transformed into chips. The gambler could then simply cash out, receiving funds in higher denominations or transferring clean money through various legitimate-looking mechanisms. Some didn't even pretend. They'd buy the chips and immediately leave the casino without placing a single bet. In one documented case, a VIP manager allegedly facilitated a $200,000 cash buy-in for a customer who then received the chips in a velvet River Rock bag and walked out without ever gambling. This wasn't accidental. River Rock systematically violated Canada's anti-money laundering laws for years. Federal regulations required them to report any suspicious transaction over $10,000, yet River Rock only reported transactions over $50,000. When investigators raised this critical issue in 2011, the casino simply kept violating the rules for 4 more years. Former BC Lottery Corporation investigator Ross Alderson warned his superiors in a September 2011 email that River Rock was actively helping high rollers avoid suspicious transaction reports. His warnings, like so many others, were ignored. Stephen Beekmer, another Lottery Corporation investigator, testified he was told to cut that DMNSHT out by his superior after he dared to question high rollers about their funds. The directive from above was absolutely clear: do not interfere with the money flowing through the casinos. Government officials had a compelling, albeit immoral, reason to look the other way. British Columbia's casinos were generating enormous tax revenue for the province. The Lottery Corporation pulled in $1.3 billion in net income in a single year, $96 million over budget, a tempting pot of gold for any administration. But some good people did try to sound the alarm. Barry Baxter, an RCMP officer who investigated suspicious casino transactions, attempted to expose the problem. Instead of support, he was publicly discredited by the then gaming minister Rich Coleman and silenced by the RCMP brass. A secret, undercover RCMP operation that ran from 2010 to 2012, which documented how loan sharks supplied VIP high rollers with suspicious cash, was ultimately shut down. Former RCMP officer Fred Pinnick even recorded secret tapes in 2018 with a former BC Liberal Solicitor General discussing the suspicion that Coleman and RCMP brass caused a tsunami of casino money laundering by shutting down Pinnick's specialized illegal gaming unit in 2009. According to those dark, secret recordings, it was all about the money. When a new government took power in 2017, the new Attorney General, David Eby, quickly discovered the full extent of the problem had been either ignored or actively suppressed by the previous administration. The casino scandals were just the tip of a much, much larger criminal iceberg. Investigative journalist Sam Cooper spent years documenting how transnational organized crime had deeply infiltrated significant portions of Canada's economy. His book, Willful Blindness, exposed what he chillingly called a cast of accomplices, governments hungry for revenue, casino and real estate companies with ties to shady offshore wealth, professional facilitators, including lawyers and bankers, and an RCMP that effectively gave organized crime the space to grow. At the dark heart of the Vancouver Model were the big circle boys, powerful transnational narco-kingpins with deep, systemic ties to corrupt Chinese officials, real estate tycoons, and industrialists. These weren't small-time criminals, they were sophisticated, ruthless operators who had gained frightening influence over the levers of Canada's financial system. The Big Circle boys funneled billions in drug money through BC casinos, then invested those funds into Vancouver real estate, luxury vehicles, and other assets. The consequences, the emotional weight, went far beyond simple inflated housing prices. The same criminal networks laundering money through Vancouver were simultaneously importing and distributing fentanyl throughout all of North America. British Columbia's government-regulated casinos had become the perfect, uncontested tools for global criminals to import deadly narcotics into Canada and wash billions in drug cash into Vancouver's housing market. The fentanyl overdose crisis that followed was a direct and tragic consequence, leading to the unthinkable, a decline in life expectancy. Cooper's deep investigation revealed a layer even more disturbing. The primary actors in the Vancouver model had essentially made Canada's West Coast a headquarters for corporate and industrial espionage by state actors. They used the lack of oversight and the system's greed in Vancouver and Canada to export their criminal model to other countries, including Australia and New Zealand. And as this empire of dirty money grew, the human story of the statistics unfolded, revealing how money laundering devastated ordinary families. Consider the devastating case of the Chen family, detailed in the heavily redacted documents from the Cullen Commission. A citizen of the People's Republic of China, referred to as Chen Milin, reported a humble average annual earnings of just $40,615 to Canadian border agents when he arrived in 2006, with a family asset base declared at $1.25 million. What transpired next defies any legitimate, reasonable explanation. Between 2010 and 2014, the Chen family moved over $114 million into Canada. The money flowed through for different companies in Hong Kong and mainland China, passed through numerous offshore companies and tax havens, and was ultimately funneled through an underground banking network of currency exchanges, some with established connections to organized crime. By January 2022, the family's Canadian property holdings had exploded. Chen's first known property purchase in Vancouver was a home in the upscale Shaughnessy neighborhood for just under $2.3 million. He and his wife sold it years later for $4.9 million. Then, in 2012, their daughter purchased a massive mansion featuring a tennis court and swimming pool near the beach in Point Grey for a staggering $14.7 million. The Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, FinTrack, analysed multiple transfers into accounts held by Chen's mother. The pattern was undeniable and criminal, massive amounts of money moving through highly suspicious channels, flowing directly into Vancouver real estate. Chen was eventually subject to deportation proceedings in 2016, and Interpol listed him as wanted for bribery. The immigration proceedings are now sealed, but the catastrophic damage to Vancouver's housing market had already been done. One single family, using money that Canadian authorities strongly suspected came from criminal sources, purchased a total of $32 million in real estate, helping to drive up prices for everyone else. The Chen case was not a fluke. Transparency International Canada found that nearly half of the most valuable real estate in Vancouver was owned by anonymous companies, shell corporations that allowed bad actors to keep their identities completely hidden from authorities while using Canadian real estate as what the executive director of Transparency International Canada called a bank rather than a home. Many of these properties sat empty, used purely as a vehicle to store illicit wealth, not as a roof over the head of a family who desperately needed somewhere to live. When you're a young family trying to buy your first home, and prices are already astronomical, an additional 7.5% increase from criminal money is the devastating difference between barely affording something and being priced out entirely. For a $1 million home, a modest purchase by Vancouver standards, that's an extra $75,000 in price inflation, all directly attributable to criminal money laundering. Real families paid the true, human price. A teacher and a nurse, both earning solid middle-class salaries, found themselves utterly unable to afford even a small condo in the very city where they worked. They watched in horror as properties they could have purchased 5 years earlier doubled in value, partly because dirty money was relentlessly flooding the market. They were forced to move farther and farther from work, accepting soul-crushing commutes and smaller homes. Eventually, the pressure became too great, and some simply gave up entirely, leaving Vancouver for more affordable cities. Meanwhile, the people laundering the money lived in mansions they rarely occupied. Students with no visible means of support somehow purchased multi-million-dollar properties. Working-class families on paper owned homes worth tens of millions of dollars. The disconnect between reported income and property values was so obvious that anyone looking closely could immediately see something was wrong. But for years, nobody in authority looked closely, because the corrupt system benefited too many powerful interests. Developers loved the influx of capital because it meant buyers with cash who didn't need financing and were utterly unconcerned about price. Real estate agents earned massive commissions on multi-million-dollar sales without asking a single difficult question about the source of the funds. Lawyers facilitated these transactions through complex corporate structures, specifically designed to obscure beneficial ownership. Banks processed huge cash deposits and wire transfers without adequate due diligence. And the provincial government collected enormous property transfer taxes and annual property taxes from every single one of these transactions. Everyone got a piece of the pie, so everyone was incentivized to look the other way. Peter German, a former deputy RCMP commissioner tasked with reviewing BC's anti-money laundering policies, found thousands of specific properties worth billions flagged as high risk for potential money laundering, tax evasion, or both. His conclusion was chilling: no agency or police force had adequate oversight or resources to investigate these suspicious activities. German's reports on casinos, real estate, luxury cars, and even horse racing demonstrated just how pervasive dirty money had become throughout BC's economy. But the conspiracy didn't stop at turning a blind eye. The RCMP's 2019 arrest of its top intelligence official, Cameron Ortiz, raised terrifying questions. Ortiz had oversight of many investigations into transnational money laundering networks and insight into sensitive probes of suspects seeking to undermine Canada's democracy. Could foreign state actors or transnational criminals have gained protection from inside the Mounties? The possibility of a deliberate, high-level betrayal became the dark new reality of the Vancouver Model. In May 2019, the provincial government finally appointed BC Supreme Court Justice Austin Cullen to lead a formal public inquiry into money laundering. The Cullen Commission heard from nearly 200 witnesses over 18 months, examining 70,000 pages of evidence. Former premiers, gaming ministers, casino operators, RCMP officers, brave whistleblowers, and experts all testified about what they knew and, critically, when they knew it. The Commission's massive 1,804-page final report, delivered in June 2022, laid the blame squarely on multiple system failures and on those who had full knowledge but failed to act. The report directly faulted senior provincial government ministers, including former Premier Christy Clark, for being repeatedly warned about suspected criminal cash in government casinos, but utterly failing to ensure those funds were not accepted. The report found that former gaming minister Rich Coleman's public comments, which downplayed the concerns, posed a real risk of misleading the public into believing there was no basis for concern, even though Coleman had strong reason to be worried. However, the Cullen Commission reached a highly controversial conclusion that immediately sparked intense national debate. While acknowledging that money laundering had absolutely occurred and had inflated prices, the report stated there was no evidence that money laundering was the primary cause of Vancouver's affordability crisis. The report instead pointed to a complex web of factors: supply and demand, massive population increase, and low interest rates as more important price drivers. Commissioner Cullen concluded that the steps taken to counteract money laundering, while essential, wouldn't serve as the complete solution for housing unaffordability. This finding disappointed, even infuriated, many who hoped the inquiry would fully validate their belief that dirty money was the sole culprit behind the housing crisis. But Cullen's conclusion, while controversial, was more nuanced than a simple dismissal. Money laundering did contribute to the price increases. The estimated 5 to 7.5% figure was very real. But it wasn't the only factor, or even the largest one. Vancouver's affordability crisis was, and remains, a perfect storm of converging problems: limited housing supply constrained by restrictive geography and zoning, massive population growth, historically low interest rates encouraging borrowing, foreign investment, both legitimate and criminal, speculation, and inadequate government action to increase affordable housing stock. The distinction matters deeply because some officials wanted to use money laundering as a convenient political excuse to avoid addressing the other deeply difficult issues, like zoning reform, increased density, and public housing investment. If money laundering was the sole cause, then stopping it would solve everything. The reality, however, was far more complex. Stopping money laundering was absolutely necessary and would help moderate prices, but it wouldn't, by itself, make Vancouver affordable for middle-class families again. What the Cullen Commission definitively established was that a potent mix of greed, corruption, and willful blindness had allowed money laundering to flourish for a devastatingly long time. Casino operators blatantly prioritized profits over compliance. BC Lottery Corporation executives deliberately ignored their anti-money laundering obligations. Gaming regulators failed to enforce the most basic rules. Police investigations were systematically undermined or shut down. And government officials turned a deliberate blind eye because casino revenue was deemed too valuable to risk. The government launched reforms, Canada's first public registry of beneficial owners to end the hidden ownership of real estate, an online register for pre-sale condo assignments, and strengthened property transfer tax audits. But implementation has been painfully slow, and enforcement remains extremely challenging. Creating registries is one thing, ensuring compliance and investigating violations requires both massive resources and political will. The brutal truth is that money launderers adapt quickly, always finding creative ways to exploit the inevitable loopholes. The Beneficial Ownership Registry, for example, faced immediate criticism for weak verification requirements and a lack of serious penalties for false filings. The most heartbreaking truth is that the damage to Vancouver's housing market has already been done. Prices that skyrocketed during the money laundering boom have not come back down to pre-boom levels, even as dirty money has been squeezed out. Once prices reach a certain, inflated level, they become sticky. Homeowners who purchased at peak prices don't want to sell at a loss. Banks holding mortgages on overvalued properties don't want to acknowledge the loss. And new buyers, seeing historical price trends, still cling to the expectation that prices will eventually recover. Meanwhile, the devastating social consequences continue to unfold. Young professionals who would have stayed in Vancouver are leaving for more affordable cities. Families are pushed farther into distant suburbs with soul-crushing, longer commutes. Essential workers like teachers, nurses, and transit operators simply can't afford to live near their jobs. The vibrant diversity that once defined Vancouver is slowly eroding, as only the extreme wealthy can afford to stay. The fentanyl crisis, which money laundering directly helped to fuel, continues to brutally kill Canadians. In 2023, British Columbia recorded over 2,500 drug toxicity deaths. The synthetic opioids that the Big Circle boys and other criminal networks imported using money laundered through BC casinos are still in the drug supply, and the criminal infrastructure remains intact. These organizations didn't disappear, they simply adapted, finding new ways to launder money and new markets to ruthlessly exploit. And some of those new markets are right next door. The Vancouver model has already been exported. Australian authorities identified similar, terrifying patterns in their own casinos and real estate markets. New Zealand has grappled with its own money laundering problems linked to the very same criminal networks that perfected their craft in Vancouver. The techniques perfected in British Columbia are now being used globally. And the problems are absolutely not limited to the West Coast. The crisis that hit British Columbia is part of a broader, national pattern of real estate being weaponized for money laundering and fraud across Canada. Ontario recently uncovered its own massive, $11 million mortgage fraud scheme that shows exactly how greed and criminal activity can bring down entire housing markets. That fraud targeted vulnerable immigrant communities and left hundreds of families in financial ruin as property values collapsed in affected neighborhoods. That Ontario case reveals different tactics, but the same underlying, devastating combination of greed and the willful blindness that enabled Vancouver's crisis.